That's YouTube in place. Well, YouTube being sent. Hopefully it will actually work. Just give that a second. That looks like it's in place. All right. Good afternoon to everyone. I hope you are all doing well. I hope everybody is in their preparation for Pesach mode. That doesn't mean that you should be killing yourself cleaning. It shouldn't be that hard for most of you. And I've done classes on that before, but always contact me if you have specific questions. But more likely you are involved in reading and studying and learning, not just how to observe Passover in the kashrut sense, but how to understand it historically, spiritually, emotionally, and that. If you are following along with how we get ready for Passover, then of course you'll know that just a little while ago, 2 weeks, I guess, 2 Shabbatot ago, we had the section of Parasha Adumah, a special reading regarding the purification rituals for those that had come into contact with the dead. This was essential as a preliminary step towards Passover, because if you had a degree of impurity such as that, you would not be able to partake of the Passover sacrifice. Excuse me. It had to be offered in purity. As I've talked about many times, purity doesn't mean dirt or unhygienic. It means ritual purity. And going through these rituals would be very important. And that is how we're going to transition into today's topic. I will say right up off the top, if you are watching this with small children, not that I think many people watch my class with small children, you may want to pause, have them leave the room, and watch it by yourself first, and then share it with them later. Nothing here is going to be obscene, but we will be talking about different parts of the human body and some of their function in both the regular and irregular manner. And that's not always something that everybody is prepared to share with their family, depending upon their age and maturity. So by all means, take a pause, double check it before you share it with anyone that is a little bit younger. It will not be silly, it's not going to be puerile, and it certainly won't be obscene, but you should just be forewarned. Hopefully that has given everyone enough time to scramble over and hit the pause button, just in case they were interested in checking it before it went on further. So now let's get on with the show, because we are going to talk about the emissions from the genitive organs. Now, usually when we talk about this, we are talking about the concept of nida. Now, nida is the monthly cycle that a woman's body experiences as it goes through the menses, to use some of the technical terminology. And in that process, when the period begins, that is to say, when the discharge of the uterus begins, the woman becomes ritually impure, and she also becomes a source of ritual impurity for other people or things she comes into contact with. Now, this is a different type of impurity, a different degree of impurity than the contact with the deceased, for example, or the contact with certain other types of animals or materials. And we're not going to get in all of those layers today. But we do tend to spend a lot of time talking about nida because it is, well, a monthly activity. Or at least for many women, it is a monthly activity for much of their life. Instead, we are going to talk about the male counterpart. And to understand this, we have to understand that in our modern halakha of nida, we don't necessarily only have nida. In fact, nida itself is rarely what is being followed. Instead, it is about an abnormal discharge, what's known as a woman being a zava, and zav being the male equivalent. Now, an abnormal discharge means a discharge from the genitive organ at the not regular time. Obviously, the monthly cycle is the regular time. And if the monthly cycle is the time that is happening according to the Torah, then there is a 7-day period. And after that period, mikvah, and it is done. However, if the discharge is not at the regular time, if the discharge is not in the normal cycle, then a woman becomes a zava, and in that process, you have to wait until the discharge has completed its cycle completely, no more signs of emission, and then count an additional 7 clean days from the end. Those of you that are familiar with the laws of Taharat Mishpacha, the family purity laws of our contemporary halacha, will know that sounds much more like what families observe today. And indeed they do. I've gone into that before of how we switched from doing just nida with its 7 days, regardless of whether they were clean or not, simply because it is part of the cycle, and how we switched to doing basically treating every monthly cycle as though it were irregular. So I'm not going to go into the whole underpinning of how that happened, that switch of terminology and of observance. But I do want to talk about men, because with all of our focus on women, because of the monthly cycle, we often forget that there are also categories of emission that have ritual implications for men. And so that's what we're going to look at today in Leviticus 15. We're going to get the Torah out of the way, and then we are going to talk about what it actually means, and then we're going to talk about what it means big picture. And again, because we are talking about the genitive organs, this is why it's going to be rather delicate. So, chapter 15, let's get going. Oh, come on, stop moving. There we go. Adonai spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when a man has a discharge from his issuing from his member," that's the term here is literally flesh, but it is clearly a euphemism for the penis. He is impure. And again, just like with nida or a zava, a zav is ritually impure. The impurity from his discharge shall mean the following: whether his member runs with the discharge or it is stopped up so that there is no discharge, his impurity means this. So again, this means that there is some form of emission, fluidy-like substance that is leaking from the member, and whether it is leaking in a run or whether it is clogged, this is the implication. Any bedding on which the one with the discharge lies shall be impure, and every object on which he sits shall be impure. Very similar to the laws of Zava, as you'd expect for a woman. Those persons who touch his bedding shall wash their clothes, bathe in water, and remain impure until evening, meaning that the impurity will eventually expire. Those who sit on an object on which the one with the discharge has sat shall wash their clothes, bathe in water, and remain impure until evening. Those who touch the body of one with the discharge, meaning flesh-to-flesh contact, shall wash their clothes, bathe in water, and remain impure until evening. Okay, so that should be so far relatively familiar if you've followed any of the discussion about ritual purity. And now in verse 8, we have to talk about a little bit more. If the one with a discharge spits on someone who is pure, the latter shall wash their clothes, bathe in water, and remain impure until evening. And just a reminder that when we talk about remaining impure and the impurity we're talking about here, this is only separating a person from the sacrificial service or eating other foods that by law have to be eaten in a state of ritual purity. This is not a criticism of the person. This is simply saying that is the status they have. Verse 9. Any means for riding that the one with the discharge has mounted shall be impure, meaning saddles. All those who touch anything that was under him shall be impure until evening, and all those who carry such things shall wash their clothes, bathe in water, and remain impure until evening. So far, you're picking up the pattern, I'm sure. Verse 11. All those whom the one with the discharge touches, without having rinsed his hands in water, shall wash their clothes, bathe in water, and remain impure until evening. So whether he touches a person, whether they touch him, it all makes a difference. An earthen vessel that the one with the discharge touches shall be broken, and any wooden implement shall be rinsed with water. As we have talked about when talking about kashrut, clay vessels, what's known as the cheres, is, I guess you could call it super absorbent. More importantly, once it has absorbed by coming into contact with something that is ritually impure or not kosher, or meat, if you're worried about the mixing of meat and milk for those objects, once it has come into contact, it takes on that new substance, and it can never be completely expelled, rendering it useless if we're talking about something that is going to be made ritually impure permanently at this point, as opposed to a wooden implement, or indeed other types as well, which have other ways of being cleansed. But clay does not. Verse 13, when the one with the discharge becomes purified of his discharge, he shall count off 7 days for his purification, wash those clothes, and bathe his body in fresh water. That's our mayim chayim, our classic phrase for the type of water used in the mikveh. Then he shall be pure. Now you'll notice that that's going to sound very much like the process for a zava, right? For a zava, the female equivalent for an irregular female discharge. Shouldn't be surprised that there are equivalencies in these two things, that he goes for as long as the discharge is still happening. Once it stops, then he goes through that procedure. And on the 8th day, verse 14, on the 8th day he shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons and come before Adonai at the tent of the meeting and give them to the priest. The priest shall offer them, the one is a sin offering and the other is a burnt offering. Thus the priest shall make an expiation on his behalf for his discharge before Adonai. Now, that's the irregular form of a discharge, where the male member, the penis, is leaking or expelling something in a non-normal expected way. This could happen, we know medically, from certain conditions, most notably certain types of venereal diseases can often cause this. Certain illnesses might cause this, but that seems to be what we're talking about in those cases. In verse 16, we're going to talk about something similar but different. When a man has an emission of semen, he shall bathe his whole body in water and remain impure until evening. So what is the difference between this discharge, this emission, and that discharge that we read about in verses 1 to 15? Well, this is the more normal variety of ejaculate, of the man having the semen come out. It's not a unusual discharge because it's identified as being that normal bodily fluid. Nevertheless, when this happens, the man is then considered to be ritually impure and has to go through the bathing process. And continuing with that theme, verse 17, all cloth or leather on which the semen falls shall be washed in water and remain impure until evening. Likewise for a woman, when a man has carnal relations with her, both shall bathe in water and remain impure until evening. Meaning that the ejaculate on her, in her, also creates the same impurity and has the same remedy of washing and a temporary state of ritual impurity. All right, we're going to stop there, partly because I can only say the word emission so many times before I need to take a break. And I want to just open it up for a few questions, if anyone has any, before we get down to what does this all mean. Not surprisingly, people are reluctant, perhaps, to chime in.
A quick question, and maybe the commentary will answer this. In verse 16, is this a voluntary or involuntary emission?
Yes. So if this were, for example, a willing act of sexual congress, that would count. If this was something that you woke up from and in the morning realized that there had been an emission during your dream, that would also count.
Okay.
So yes, it is both voluntary and involuntary. If it is, well, the technical term is zara, and zara is seed, as was the usual concept of what that bodily fluid was at the time. But we can get into the biology of what they might have thought was going on and why that term was used some other time. Okay, so what do we do? Does this mean that we are constantly ritually impure after every act of intimacy? Does this mean that we are limited from doing anything that requires ritual purity, either after intimacy or after a discharge from an illness? Well, yes, in the sense that we couldn't go to the Temple Mount, but we don't have an altar and we don't have a temple there to sacrifice at anyway. Is there an actual practical matter that is involved here? Is there something that does make a difference day to day? And the short answer is yes and no. And that long answer is going to be the rest of our discussion. So let's go ahead and jump in and look at some of our texts on this. And by texts, I mean Rambam. I normally don't like to only quote from one source, but as is his way, he summarizes so much of the text and the feeling behind it so well and so concisely that for our 1 hour class, it is an excellent entry into the main topics that we are covering. So first, he's going to talk about the concept of reading the Shema. And the question would become, if you are ritually impure because you had an emission, either the irregular or the regular, meaning the willing or unwilling discharge of semen, do you still read the Shema, even if you are ritually impure? And Rambam, again, summarizing from Mishnah and Talmud and Jewish law, all those ritually impure are obligated to read the Shema and recite the blessings before and after it, in their impure state. This applies even when it is possible for them to purify themselves that day. So you might have thought that if you were ritually impure because of this emission, that you would not be allowed to read the Shema. And we're going to see why that would have been your thought. But Rambam is pointing out, no, even if you are ritually impure, you still need to read from the Shema. Why might I have thought that was a problem? Well, Ezra, and by Ezra we do mean Ezra the scribe, Ezra from the time of the rebuilding of the Second Temple, Ezra and his colleagues, meaning the court of his day, decreed that a man who had a seminal emission was forbidden to read the words of the Torah. They made a decree for their time and in their belief going forward. Thus, they separated him from the other ritually impure until he immersed himself in a mikveh. So they said, look, if you've had a seminal emission, you cannot read from the Torah, and the Shema is indeed words of Torah, until you have immersed yourself. And yes, I know somebody else who has come into contact with the dead, and somebody who has had a sheretz, one of the creepy crawlies, somebody who came into contact with Nida, all of them, they are absolutely allowed to read from the Shema, but you who had this emission, you are not allowed to read from the Torah until you go to the mikveh. That's what we mean by a decree. They made a rule that was different than the basic rule of what the Torah and both written and oral had given us to that point. Okay, hold on, we're not done yet. This ordinance was not universally accepted among the Jewish people. Most were unable to observe it, and it was therefore negated. The Jewish people accepted the custom of reading the Torah and reciting the Shema even after a seminal emission, because the words of Torah cannot contract ritual impurity. Rather, they stand in their state of purity forever. As Jeremiah says, "Are not my words like fire, declares the Lord. Just as fire is incapable of becoming ritually impure, so too the words of Torah are never defiled." Okay, so we're going to talk about the basic law, and then we're going to talk about the drama that is being exposed in this discussion. So the basic law is that he made this decree. The people said, and went ahead doing what they had been doing, which was reading the Shema regardless of the emission that they had had. And the justification for ignoring the ruling of the rabbis, of Ezra and his court, was that it's not going to hurt the words of Torah, right? The words of Torah are words of fire, and fire cannot be made ritually impure. There's nothing I can do to the Torah, meaning the actual content of the Torah, that would render it impure. So I am not defiling it, even though I am personally ritually impure. There was no way for me, no matter who I am, to contaminate the words of Torah. Now that is a profound and amazing spiritual and emotional way to understand our relationship to the Torah. No matter where we stand, no matter what we have done, no matter how flawed we may feel, we can't make the Torah impure. We cannot lessen the Torah. And that means the Torah is available and open to everyone, regardless of their current status. Obviously, we should do what we can to improve wherever we currently stand, but we should never withhold ourselves from Torah because we think somehow we are dirty and unworthy of it. The Torah is fire, and fire can never be defiled by anything. So step right up, join in Torah, it's fine, regardless of where you are. But this was a decision made by the average people, not by the court. The court said, that's not true. You have to go and immerse. That seminal emission means you are now in a special category different than any others, and you have to go to the mikveh. And yet the nation of Israel turned to Ezra, who is no slouch, right? Leader of the generation, and to his court, which would have been the greatest sages of that time, and said, no, we don't accept that. We don't accept your ruling. We don't accept your decree. That is something we need to discuss in much more detail. Just a quick question. There was a question in the chat. So the question is, why is this bodily fluid separated and counted as unclean as compared to other bodily fluids, especially if we're born perfect and all body parts function as intended, meaning no disease, and of course, menstrual blood as well. And so it's a great question because the Torah doesn't give us an explicit answer. The Torah is explicit that both the regular and irregular discharges from our genitive organs, both for male and female, create types of ritual impurity. And again, the laws of that are complicated of exactly which type and how it works, but we can say they all create some form of ritual impurity. But the Torah doesn't tell us why those create ritual impurity when other bodily fluids do not. So if I were to just be walking down the street and wipe the sweat off my brow, no ritual impurity. But if there was this leakage from a genitive organ, then yes, ritual impurity. Why? Well, the Torah doesn't give us the answer, but there have been a number of explanations, interpretations that have been given by tradition. The usual version that I have found to be most helpful is that both within the natural and irregular functioning of our genitive organs, we are the closest to God as we can ever be as a human being. We are on the threshold of life. We are on the threshold of creation itself. I'm trying to say creation and Bereshit at the same time. I'm sorry. We are on the threshold of Bereshit. We are on the threshold of creation. We are at our most divine in those moments. And whether it is interrupted by the natural cycle, meaning that no pregnancy occurred, or whether it is interrupted by an irregular discharge, meaning our body in that area is not working 100% as normal, or even if it is in the willing act of copulation, there is still a bump that forces us to pause, reflect, and reset, which is really what ritual impurity does at all times, is it causes us to pause, reflect, and reset. You can watch my most recent prayerful meditation, where I try to give a little bit more of the understanding of that concept. So we shouldn't take it as being that these liquids are flawed, or these liquids are wrong or contaminatory, if that is a word, contaminating. Instead, we should look at it as these particular liquids, these particular emissions from our body, come at a moment which require the most reflection, which require the most presence of mind, and require us to pause. And indeed, that pausing is going to come to the heart of why Ezra tried to make this decree in the first place, which we will talk about with our next section from Rambam. All the ritually impure, meaning of any variety, need only wash their hands in order to pray, just as others. Every morning we do a hand washing. This hand washing is not accompanied by a blessing, but it is done as a preparatory to putting us into a proper place to be able to do tefillah. And whether you are ritually pure or whether you are ritually impure, both need to do this hand washing. And if you are ritually impure, even though the hand washing does not actually change your overall status, because until you have fully immersed, it can't be changed, nonetheless, it is still required. Even if they are able to immerse, this immersion is not required, as we hinted at in the first text. So that is the same for everyone. And we then have to understand, well, why did Ezra separate those that had the seminal emission from all the other forms of emission? These decrees were not put into effect because of the questions of ritual purity and impurity, but rather to ensure that the Torah scholars would not overindulge in marital intimacy with their wives. Therefore, they instituted ritual immersion only for one who has a seminal emission, thereby accepting him from the other ritually impure. So Ezra, according to Rambam, and the Talmud, of course, is where he gets this from, wasn't trying to put a decree in about the seminal emission because of purity or impurity. He was trying to put something in place in order to put a pause on the amount of intimacy that a scholar would indulge in, that they should not be, essentially, they should not be engaging in constant intimacy to the neglect of other things that are important in life. The way to do that was to pull the lever of ritual purity, because that was a concept, being pure or impure in a ritual way, that would often motivate changes in behavior. I know in the modern world, many people do not resonate with the concept of Tumah and Tahara, but in the ancient world, even among the non-observant, those were concepts that had a lot of pull. They had a lot of influence over people's behavior. And so Ezra pulled the lever that could generate the result he wanted, which was, look, guys, think carefully before you jump into bed, especially if you're doing this a lot, because if you do, you will not be able to study until you go through the rigmarole of an immersion. And that was enough of a counterbalance that a person would not constantly be engaging in intimacy, because they would then be unable to be in a place where they could study. They had to choose one or the other. Not saying that they should never have intimacy, God forbid. That intimacy is an important part of a Jewish life for everyone. It's not as though Torah scholars stop having intimacy, but they wanted to make sure that there was a balance, and they wanted to make sure that they felt the importance of when to be intimate and when not to be, and not to just take it for granted, not to be too casual about it, and not to treat it as though it were a casual activity. And this lever of purity allowed Ezra to accomplish that. However, like we just saw back in chapter 4, verse 6, paragraph 6, it wasn't upheld. The people didn't follow it. More on that as we go. So now we know the motivation, but Did anyone ever do this? Well, yes. According to Rambam, there are people in Shinar and Spain, meaning other parts of the Middle East, as well as the Spanish communities, that did follow the custom that one who had a seminal emission does not pray until he has washed his whole body in water. Based off Amos, prepare to meet your God, Israel. To whom does this refer? To a healthy person or to a sick person who engaged in intimacy. But a sick person who had an accidental emission is exempt. So to go back to John's question earlier about was it willing or unwilling, the original rule was about either variety. But when Ezra created his additional barrier to reading Torah, it was about either variety. But as the people said, no, we can't do that, and they rolled back Ezra's edict, in these communities, they rolled it back only partially. And they said, if you are healthy or you are sick but are voluntarily engaging in intimacy, then yes, you do still need to go immerse yourself. But if you are sick, then that kind of emission is exempt and you don't need to worry about it because the illness was what was causing it. It was clearly beyond your control. And similarly, there is no such custom regarding a Zav, who that's the irregular emission, who has a seminal emission, and a menstruating woman who emits semen. Rather, they should clean themselves, wash their hands, and pray. Basically the same as everyone else. That a woman who is in the middle of nida, or either a man or a woman who has an irregular discharge, they can pray the same as everyone else. They just remove any residue from the emission, wash their hands, and then engage in tefillah as the rest of us do as well. So it's clear that we are not actually held back from prayer from this. And even though Rambam cites a minority community that did kind of follow Ezra's edict, it is not one that has caught on. And trying to figure out how in the world did we cancel something that Ezra put into place? Well, that's something we need to really discuss. Because, for example, Ezra put into place the edict as well that we would read Torah on Monday and Thursday. And in fact, there are many who say that he put in the edict that we read Torah weekly, as opposed to reading it only once every 7 years, which is what the Torah seems to be implying. So we clearly are still following a lot of the things that Ezra put into place. So why this did we cancel? And of course, how do we cancel something that is put into place by Ezra? Okay, with that in mind and looking at the clock, let's jump in to a little discussion of how we make or cancel different edicts in Judaism. Actually, just give me a second here. A court may suspend the application of such decrees temporarily, even if it is of lesser stature than the original court. So, yes, Court A made a decree. Court B can come along and say, you know, I think that Court A's decision doesn't apply right now, but they are only temporarily canceling Court A's decision. And why? The rationale is that these decrees should not be considered as more severe than the words of the Torah itself. And any court has the authority to abrogate the words of the Torah as a temporary measure. Now, before your heads explode, we're going to explain that. Or rather, we're going to discuss that. But let's get the logic here. The logic is based on the idea that sometimes, temporarily, we can suspend certain parts of the Torah. And if we can temporarily suspend certain parts of the Torah, then clearly we can temporarily suspend certain edicts of different rabbinic courts. Now, what do we mean by temporarily suspend parts of Torah? If a court sees that it is necessary to strengthen the faith and create a safeguard so that the people will not violate Torah law, they may apply beatings and punishments that are not sanctioned by the Torah. So if they need to turn the screws, that these were the styles of punishment back then, or impose fines in the community for people to observe Torah more. For example, if you wanted to put a fine on everybody who didn't wear tefillin, if you thought that was going to help save Torah and save Judaism, a court could have the option of doing that, even though the Torah itself never said that fining people for not wearing tefillin was the appropriate punishment. But temporarily, a court can take measures that are not in the Torah in order to preserve the Torah. However, they may not, however, establish the matter for posterity and say that this is the halakha. Even if they put in a temporary measure like this, even if it is widespread and critical for the community, even if they believe this is the best idea ever, they can't call it Torah. They can't call it halakha. They have to be clear and explicit that this is a decree, what we would call a takana, that this is a temporary activity, a temporary behavior that is only justified because of the crisis of the moment, and in no way, shape, or form do they believe that it is found in the Torah itself as a commandment or as the proper application of a commandment. It is the application of the commandment that the court has the authority to do this, but it is not about the topic itself. It is only the general power of the court that gives them the authority to do this. And that is something that can be hard to reconcile, that indeed we do have not only the opportunity, but sometimes the obligation to temporarily change what the Torah has asked us to do in order that we can make sure that we can get through a crisis. So, for example, because he's not done with this, because obviously this is an important topic. Similarly, if they saw that temporarily, that word is very important, it was necessary to nullify a positive commandment or violate a negative commandment in order to bring people at large back to the Jewish faith or to prevent many Jews from transgressing in other matters, they may do what is necessary at that time. So yes, this authority is quite large, that temporarily they can nullify a commandment saying you don't need to do X anymore, or temporarily saying you're allowed to do X, even though normally you wouldn't, because right now, if we don't change that particular aspect right now, just for this temporary time period, then we will lose everything else. Sometimes you have to have triage. Sometimes the court does need to act in a dramatic fashion. To explain by analogy, Rambam says, just like a doctor may amputate a person's hand or foot so that the person as a whole will live, so too, at times the court may rule to temporarily violate some of the commandments so that they will later keep all of them. In this vein, the sages of the previous generation said, desecrate one Shabbat for a person's sake so that he will keep many Shabbats. That we don't obviously want to desecrate Shabbat, but there are some life and death moments, some critical, pivotal points in our history or our time where we will keep a commandment in ways that are not the original version, or even skip a commandment because of the importance of that time. And that is absolutely essential in those moments. Now, this is obviously for crisis, this is obviously for danger, this is obviously for moments of triage where there is some critical problem in the community, and only to the best of the judgment of the court will these changes allow us to continue and preserve and persevere, and thus they are allowed. So this is a very important topic, but not one that comes up a lot, at least we hope not. More about that as we go. When a court issues, sees it is necessary to issue a decree, institute an edict, or establish a custom, they must first contemplate the matter and see whether or not the majority of the community can uphold the practice. We never issue a decree on the community unless the majority of the community can uphold the practice. And maybe now you're beginning to understand why Ezra's practice failed. That the court has to actually have a sense of, well, could the community do this? If we tell everybody, if you don't wear tefillin, we are going to fine you $100 a day, will the community actually support such a decree? Will they all rush out, buy tefillin, and show up at Minyan and have those on their head, assuming that we're actually in a community that could even enforce such a decree? And I would imagine that in many communities that kind of decree wouldn't work. And that kind of decree, therefore, should not be made because the majority wouldn't be able to do it. Now, notice that the majority is what we are following here. We're not saying, well, all the righteous people can do it, and therefore it's only the bad people that are going to be punished. All the good people are fine, and everybody, I'm sure, who's a good person will be on board, and we don't need to worry about the bad people because they're bad. No, that's not how we divide a community. If the majority can't do it, it doesn't matter whether some of the extremely scrupulous and very, very punctilious and absolutely obsessed could. If the majority can't, we don't. Then that decree should not be issued. If a court issued a decree thinking that the majority of the community could uphold it, and after the decree was issued, the majority of the community raised contentions, and the practice did not spread throughout the majority of the community, the decree is nullified. The court cannot compel the people to accept it. So if somebody decides that from now on, only chicken is kosher, right? Because we just need to make changes in kashrut, and I don't know what they would be thinking, but we're going to make it so that only chicken is kosher, no other meat is kosher, no fish, no cow, no lamb, only chicken from now on will be kosher. And they think, well, of course, everyone can do that because, chicken isn't that expensive compared to beef. And who doesn't love chicken? And then after having made this decision, thinking that the majority would go along with it, they begin to get the angry letters and phone calls and people saying, this is the craziest thing I've ever heard. And I'm not going to only eat chicken. I need to have my hamburger. Or what about lamb? And fish is, much more important to me and blah, 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 blah. If the people won't accept it, if the majority doesn't accept it and it doesn't catch on, then it disappears automatically. You don't need someone else to officially cancel it. It becomes canceled immediately, whether or not the court recognizes their error. If it doesn't catch on, it never happened. And that edict disappears into the history of our people. And indeed, such edicts have disappeared into to our people. Now, let me just finish up this section before we get to part 9. But I want to get this done so we can talk a little bit about how this can affect Passover, and then we'll talk in part 9. If the sages issued a decree and thought that it spread among the entire Jewish people, and the situation remained unchanged for many years, after a long duration of time, another court arose and checked throughout the Jewish community and saw that the observance of this decree had not spread throughout the Jewish community. It has the authority to negate the decree, even if it is of lesser stature than the original court in wisdom and in number of adherents. So obviously, if in Ezra's time people followed his decree, which we're not sure about, but imagine they did, and then 200, 300, 400 years later, we check again and realize nobody's following this decree of Ezra, even though the courts that came that far after Ezra were not nearly of the same caliber of Ezra's court. Nonetheless, because that decree has been neglected, it is able to be canceled by that later court, even though that later court may be inferior to Ezra's court, as indeed most courts would be considered inferior to Ezra's court. And then last but not least, before we get to our contemporary discussion, if a court releases 2 decrees, it should not rush to release another. Rambam is bringing down some very good advice here, which is don't get trigger happy. Don't run around making a whole bunch of new decrees. You may think you know what's best for everyone and you know what needs to happen and you know how to save the Jewish people and there was such a crisis in this and such a crisis in that, and this decree is going to be everything. Judaism has remained amazingly cohesive and whole across thousands of years and thousands of miles, often without good communication between those different extremes. partly because we have been hesitant to enact decrees. But it has also remained very flexible and very organic and living, partly because we have had good sages who knew when to issue decrees. So this is an important balance. You'll notice that he says 2 decrees, that's not unreasonable, but you really need to think before you start doing more, because once everything becomes a decree here, a decree there, then Torah gets rather cloudy and much harder for people to observe and much harder for people to know what is meant for them to observe. Now, how does this apply to Passover before we get into a little bit more of the general idea of how Jewish law works? Well, many of you, I hope, are aware that in the Ashkenazic world, the European Jewish descent, most people are reluctant to eat what we call kitniot, often translated as legumes, but specifically things like beans that are off limits for Ashkenazic Jews because of a decree, just like this. The Ashkenazic community decreed not to use beans and bean flour in particular during Passover because of the danger that you might transgress using real flour and mixing it with water and creating chametz. And that is a decree that caught on. That decree did stick. Now, they did also make a similar decree about potatoes, but that decree never caught on, partly because potatoes are just one of God's perfect foods, and people could not do without potatoes once potatoes have been introduced to Europe. But we see both happening, both sides of our discussion happening here, meaning that with regards to beans, most Ashkenazic people at that time did follow the practice and refused to use beans, and potatoes, most people didn't follow that practice and continue to use potatoes. And to this day, potatoes are perfectly fine, and no one says that we're all terrible for ignoring the decree that was ignored from the beginning. But with regards to kitniot, there is more of a divided opinion, which is, if that decree is based upon majority of acceptance, do we now say that the majority of Jews follow it or don't? And this is tricky because now the definition of majority could include all Jews, including the Sephardic Jewish community, but most people would argue that they were never intended to be a target of the initial decree, and thus we have to focus only on Ashkenazic Jews. But even within the Ashkenazic world, it is unclear whether or not a majority of Ashkenazic Jews continue to follow the decree against kitniot or whether they don't. And so for some, they say this decree could be nullified because a majority of Jews do not follow it, and others say, no, it must be protected. Now, protected doesn't necessarily mean all of the extraneous and extreme measures that some people go with regards to beans, but still avoiding, kitniot, meaning the actual bean flour, might still be appropriate in some communities, depending upon the majority. But again, you have other people who would like to say, well, the majority of my synagogue, as opposed to a majority of all Jews. But you'll notice that the definition of community is very open in Rambam's argument here. And so this is a live issue, one that continues to be of great discussion in many different circles. If people would like to know more about that, I'd be more than happy to give you some more resources. But I don't want to leave before we talk a little bit more about Jewish law in general, because if you are like me, you may be thinking all of these decrees and all of these prohibitions or relaxing, what happens to Torah? What actually happens then to the Torah itself? Doesn't this mean that rabbis can just make stuff up? And sure, they'll say it's not in the Torah, it's a decree, but don't we just get farther and farther away from the Torah? And doesn't the Torah say, don't do this? Well, like you might expect, Rambam has a very good summary of how this works and why we should be careful, but also why it is not an actual problem. A court has the authority to issue a decree and forbid something which is permitted and have its decree perpetuated for generations to come. So we have talked. Similarly, it has the authority, as a temporary measure to release the Torah's prohibitions, as we have discussed. What then is the meaning of the scriptural prohibitions in Deuteronomy 13? Do not add to it and do not detract from it. Right? If the Torah says don't add to the Torah and don't subtract from the Torah, then if any Johnny-come-lately rabbi can add something or take something away as a decree, even if it's only temporary, well, isn't that adding or taking away from the Torah? Okay, the court does not have the authority to add to or subtract from the words of the Torah, establishing a matter forever as part of scriptural law. This applies both to the written law and the oral law. Very important part and concept here, one that I have tried to hammer over and over and over in my Mishnah class, because this is where it comes up most in my teaching, which is there is a huge difference between saying what I am teaching you as a rabbi is in the Torah, whether I mean written or oral Torah, and what I am saying is a takana, an edict, or a custom. And knowing the difference between them is something that is absolutely critical, and something that the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Midrash, and every rabbinic book goes to great lengths to try and help people understand this is from the Torah, written or oral, and this is not. This is a decree, this is a custom. And even though we are still obligated to both of them, even though we keep both activities or prohibitions, we always in Jewish study differentiate between this and that, between what is in Torah, written or oral, and what is not in Torah, but is part of rabbinic enactments, edicts, and positions or customs, and everything else. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people in casual conversation blur the line. I mean, absolutely smudge it. And there are many people, especially in the last couple hundred years, who have taken custom as though it is the most important thing ever, and have often trampled Torah in the process. And that is a huge issue. But within Jewish study itself, when done correctly, we always try to highlight the difference between something that is Torah itself and something that is of rabbinic enactment. But you might still be wondering, well, what about all these rabbinic enactments? Why are we doing this? What's going on? And Rambam gives, I think, a very clear example. What is implied? Well, the Torah states in Exodus 23, do not cook a kid, meaning a baby goat, in its mother's milk. According to the oral law, which remember is the Torah itself, just the verbal explanation, we learned that the Torah forbade both the cooking and eating of milk and meat, whether the meat of a domesticated animal or the meat of a wild beast. So the Torah itself, we believe, is clear through our received understanding through the oral law that it doesn't have to be the exact child goat with the exact mother milk, that it can be any kosher meat with any kosher milk, and that is a violation. So that is Torah itself, capital T, Torah. The meat of fowl, by contrast, birds and chickens and turkeys, that kind of stuff, is permitted to be cooked in milk according to scriptural law. The Torah does not prohibit that. The Torah never said, don't cook chicken in milk. And the rabbis in the Talmud and in every other law book are very, very clear that they understand the Torah didn't say, don't do this. However, we don't. Why not? Well, now, if a court will come and permit partaking of the meat of a wild animal cooked in milk, it is detracting from the Torah. So if I were to stand up and say, from now on, you can eat deer with milk, I would be canceling part of the Torah itself. That's what is meant by detracting from the Torah, because I am teaching something that makes part of the Torah go away. Not temporarily. I am saying it's not there at all. I am saying that part of the Torah is canceled because it never existed. On the other hand, if the court forbids the meat of fowl cooked in milk, saying that it is included in the kid, meaning the meat portion, forbidden by scriptural law, then that is adding to the Torah. If anyone tells you not eating chicken with milk is in the Torah, then they are wrong. And that is adding to the Torah, and that is prohibited. It is about identifying the source of the law, because the source of the law will determine sometimes, well, all the time, but sometimes it'll be very important when we can make changes or how we can make changes. Because it is absolutely possible, like we saw from our first topic of the decision by Ezra to not allow people who had the omission to say words of Torah, it is perfectly possible, and indeed happened, that that got nullified, that that got canceled because the population didn't listen to it. But that's the whole point. That could be nullified. But if the entire population doesn't listen to the Torah when it says don't eat pork, that doesn't go away. That doesn't mean it's okay when they eat it. That just means they're ignoring part of Torah. So where the law and where the action comes from matters greatly. Now, that is like the clearest case of adding or subtracting. But what is going on usually when we talk about this sort of thing, and what does it mean when we have an edict? If, however, the court says the meat of fowl cooked in milk is permitted according to scriptural law, meaning they're being honest, the Torah doesn't say you can't. We, however, are prohibiting it and publicizing the prohibition as a decree. We're not saying it's in the Torah. We're telling you it's a decree. And we are doing this lest the matter lead to a detriment, lest there be a problem. Right? So we're saying, look, we think there's going to be a problem if people are eating chicken and milk. And so we are now making a rule. It's not in the Torah. This is our rule, but we're making a rule to protect the Torah because we think there's a problem. And that rule is no chicken and milk. Now, what might that problem be? Well, people might say eating the meat of fowl cooked in milk is permitted because it is not explicitly forbidden by the Torah. So someone might reason, again, without the edict, if they were just, reading the Torah by themselves, that it doesn't explicitly say chicken, therefore it must be okay. Now, the answer, the conclusion they have is right. Technically, the Torah doesn't prohibit it, but the reasoning they have is wrong, because the reasoning they're using is because it's not explicitly prohibited. It's not explicitly stated, and that they're then going to turn around and use. Similarly, the meat of a wild animal cooked in milk is permitted because it is also not explicitly forbidden. So they are getting the wrong end of the stick. And they are saying, since the Torah says chicken's okay, because the Torah never mentions chicken, therefore wild animals must be okay, because the Torah never mentions wild animals. And then another person comes along and says, even the meat of a domesticated animal cooked in milk is permitted, with the exception of a goat. Why? Because only the goat is particularly mentioned, and nothing that isn't a goat then must be meant. And another will come and say, even the meat of a goat is permitted when cooked in the milk of a cow or a sheep, for the verse mentions only its mother, that is to say, an animal from the same species. And then another will come and say, even the meat of a goat is permitted when cooked in goat's milk, as long as the milk is not from the kid's mother, for the verse says its mother. So you would get lost with people nibbling away at the actual Torah if you didn't put a hard stop and say, no chicken. Because once you allow chicken in, people will reason to themselves, and they won't be asking their rabbis, they'll be reasoning to themselves, if chicken is okay, then that must mean a cheeseburger is okay. It's a slippery slope argument, but it's one that has played out time and time again, where many people will come to conclusions based upon faulty understanding of the reasoning with regard to some exceptions. And that is tragic. And that is why sometimes the rabbis have made special edicts to try and guard the edges of different laws in order to prevent them from being eroded. Thus, we forbid all meat cooked in milk, even meat from fowl, even chicken meat. This is not adding to the Torah. Instead, it is creating safeguards for the Torah. It is not changing it, it's putting a safeguard there. It's like going to a museum and there is a big red velvet rope around the sculpture. No one should think that the red velvet rope is part of the sculpture, but that red rope is there to keep you from damaging the sculpture. And yes, some people unfortunately might imagine that the rope is also put there by the artist, But no, the rope was put there because we knew it needed a little extra safety, a little extra precaution. And indeed, we've seen far too many people take selfies and damage sculptures who were willing to even step over the rope. But that is where we are. So in the issue here, we are trying to make sure that the basic Torah is protected, and we are honest, open, and explicit that the protection that's being added of no chicken and milk is a edict to protect, and it is not in the Torah itself. Now that may sound like very hair-splitting and nitpicking, but remember, being able to tell that difference can make a big difference in how it gets applied under special circumstances. So it's not of trivial concern. The practical problem of cooking Parmesan crusted chicken, someone asks, is what pan do I use, meat and dairy? Well, if you are following rabbinic Judaism, you don't cook Parmesan crusted chicken unless the chicken is one of those amazing modern vegetarian substitutes, because there is a separation for meat and milk, even with regards to chicken, because of the edict. And we do continue to follow this edict. In fact, this does continue to be a majority observed edict by the rabbis, and one that is still widely accepted. Now, I will point out that if you are on the road to kashrut, that is to say, if you are trying to start keeping kosher, that if you need a little bit of breathing room to temporarily still have chicken and milk because you're just so attached to your chicken Parmesan, then by all means, let that be a stepping stone, but don't let it be a resting place. Eventually, you'll cross the river and get to the other side. And on the other side, we don't mix chicken with milk either. In the meantime, back to the practical question someone put in chat, I would use a separate pan or a pan that you will be willing to re-kosher every time, and if you're going to use it with other kosher foods. But all of that I can work out with the questioner in more detail privately, depending upon where they are on the path of kashrut. Any other questions or comments before we wrap it up for today? All right, then I will thank everybody very much. Keep studying, don't stop. Oh wait, I think I see, wait, hold on, is there a hand up?
Quick question, Pesach is the next 2 weeks. Is the class going to continue? Or will you do as you've done in years past, take a week off in light of all of the services that you're going to be busy with?
So thank you for reminding me. Excellent question. So just as a little FYI, the 13th and the 20th, I will not be having Wednesday class, both daytime and evening. And the 14th and 21st, I will also not be having class for the Pathway to Judaism class. Thank you for reminding me about the administration details.
Thank you, Rabbi.
I get so lost in Torah, I forget I have to also do those things.
I gave up on trying to cook Parmesan crusted chicken. I thought this would ruin my kitchen. I've already koshered it. So exactly. Why would I mess that up? So thank you.
Like I said, there are some amazing chicken substitutes out there that you might try.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Take care, everyone. And if I don't see you all individually or collectively through some other class before Pesach, Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.